One of the most discussed topics in the US media right now is the crisis in China. American newspapers, bloggers and columnists are expressing their opinions on how the problems in the Chinese economy will affect the United States, whether the blow will be serious or whether nothing terrible will happen. In my article, I would like to tell more about what kind of crisis is looming over the Chinese economy, what is being written about it in the US, and most importantly, what is not being written about, so as not to traumatize the delicate mental organization of the average American, who is used to living without serious shocks. In China, according to various estimates, from 65 to 80 million flats remain unsold. This is because the Chinese have inflated the bubble in the property market by building too much property. You've probably seen videos on the internet of ghost towns where no one lives. Given that construction is a major sector of the Chinese economy, accounting for almost 14% of GDP, and the Chinese economy as a whole has provided all these years 40% of global economic growth, the deflation of this bubble will be felt not only by the Chinese themselves, but also by the whole world. By the way, Chinese citizens have already started to feel the consequences because in order to save their money for their old age, they invested it in real estate, but it is rapidly falling in value and devaluing their savings. As a consequence, the Chinese are beginning to fear for their future and are spending less. Various American experts were immediately concerned that Apple sells 20% of its iPhones in China, and if Chinese consumers start saving money, they will buy cheaper smartphone brands, and this will greatly affect the profits and capitalization of Apple, in whose shares Americans themselves prefer to keep their savings for their old age. In addition to iPhones, the United States sells other products to China. Exports to China account for about 7.5% of all American exports. The US considers this figure not that big, reassuring readers that there will not be a big downturn in the economy and income. However, some authors also mention that Europe is much more dependent on trade with China, and if Europeans trade less with China, it will hit the US, which also trades with Europe. So if we go round in a circle, a noticeable decline in the American economy cannot be avoided. But even here American experts try to calm their readers by saying that there is something good in China's problems that will have a positive impact on the US. The economic downturn in China may cause a drop in the price of oil and other goods, which the Chinese will now import less. Lower demand means lower prices, which means cheaper oil and other commodities for Americans. However, these authors were obviously compiling their reviews before the BRICS summit, which decided to admit the UAE, Iran and Saudi Arabia into the alliance. Together with Russia, these countries account for about 45% of the world's oil reserves. And in the event of a drop in demand, it would not be difficult for them to agree among themselves to cut production and support prices. While the US ruled the Middle East, it was able to influence these countries' decisions on oil production, but now oil-producing countries are free to act in their own interests. The G7 is also made up of oil-producing countries, but they only have 3.9% of oil reserves, so they can't really influence the oil market on their own. But the most interesting thing, in my opinion, that the American press ignores when considering China's problems is Taiwan. Another manifestation of the problems in the Chinese economy is the high percentage of youth unemployment. Every fifth Chinese under the age of 24 cannot find a stable source of income, and the situation is not getting better. On the contrary, there is an outflow of investment from China, a decrease in exports and orders, and the aforementioned overheating of the construction industry. All this may provoke protest moods among the unemployed young people. And in order to somehow unite Chinese society and keep young people busy, Xi Jinping may be concerned with the issue of returning Taiwan to its native harbor, which will be perceived by the Chinese society as very patriotic and may provide, in a sense, new jobs and employment of people in the ranks of the People's Liberation Army of China. Besides, Biden's arms supplies to Taiwan leave Comrade Xi no other choice because the longer he waits, the more Taiwan will arm itself, and the more difficult it will be afterwards. Of course, there is hope for the elections in Taiwan in 2024 and the loss of the pro-American party oriented towards enmity with mainland China. But the Americans are not shy to falsify the results of elections even in their own country, let alone in other countries, and we do not have to go far for an example. Of course, it is not certain that Comrade Xi will necessarily launch a military operation. At least it makes sense for him to wait for the results of the elections on the island first, and then try to influence the behavior of the Taiwanese authorities, if pro-American puppets remain, by limiting the supply of rare earth metals and other components for chip production, by putting Taiwan under blockade. And here we come to the key point: how the crisis in China will affect the US, and what the US press is silent about. Taiwan's TSMC is the largest chip maker in the world and has more than 500 regular customers who work with it. Among TSMC's customers are such firms as the already mentioned Apple, video card makers AMD and Nvidia, processor maker Intel, and many others. Most of the Taiwanese company's revenue comes from America 62% and China only 17%, while the Chinese have their own manufacturers. All this means that in the event of a blockade of Taiwan or hostilities on the island, Apple's and other American companies' sales would drop not by 20%, but much more, because left without chips, American firms would not be able to produce and sell products not only to China, but anywhere else. Therefore, the downturn in the American economy will be much bigger than the media tell us. By the way, the buyers of Taiwanese chips are also Europeans and Japanese, so their production will suffer as well. And this is not counting the fact that it is already suffering simply from a decrease in demand, because people in crisis begin to save money and spend it only on the essentials, the list of which clearly does not include smart watches or wireless speaker. Also, in the American press, for some reason, there is not a word about the fact that at the BRICS summit they discussed the transition to settlements in national currencies between the member countries of this union, which accounts for about a third of the world GDP, which is quite a lot. Apparently, they preferred to keep silent about it, so that the Americans could be sure that they would print dollars as usual in case of any problems and give each other checks for a couple of thousand before the payday. But with the increasing share of settlements in national currencies, it is more and more difficult to print dollars with impunity. And now the printed dollars return to the USA in the form of high inflation. I think they are trying to deceive Americans again, as they have already been deceived. That Russia will die from sanctions, that our neighbors are winning on the battlefield, and all that sort of thing. They really wrote such things at first, and only now they started to admit that something went wrong. Apparently, with the Chinese crisis, they are again convincing Americans that it will pass and nothing terrible will happen for America. And then, as usual, they will say that something went wrong again. That's why I read the Western press only out of curiosity about what is being discussed there. But I don't take their word for what is written there. And if Americans are trying to relax, I would advise my readers to take the crisis in China seriously, and for those who love Western goods, to buy the necessary electronics in case of any shortages in the future. Chinese products will be available because the Chinese also make chips, and because of the US sanctions, the Chinese will have nowhere to put their goods, and they may even become cheaper. But Western products may become more expensive due to the shortage of chips and partially disappear from sale. However, this is just my personal opinion, and it is not a guide to action.